My son has been dead for 30 years. I watched them lower his casket into the ground, with his favorite 90s Motorola tucked inside his suit pocket. But tonight, as I sat across from his widow, a digital trill screamed from the antique china cabinet. She did not gasp. She just smirked. When I lifted the receiver, the static cleared, and my dead son whispered a warning that shattered my reality. My name is Eleanor Whitford. I am 58 years old, and for most of my life, I dealt in absolute certainties. As a former treasury manager at Ravenhill Capital Reserve, I spent decades ensuring that columns balanced and ledgers told the truth. I knew how to spot a discrepancy in a spreadsheet from a mile away, but I had failed to see the lies living under my own roof. I lived alone now in a sprawling, drafty estate in the suburbs of Eastbridge, a place where the silence was so loud it often felt like a physical weight. Every corner of this house was a museum dedicated to a past that refused to stay dead. My son, Marcus Whitford, was supposed to be dead. The official report stated he died 30 years ago in a private plane crash over the Atlantic. There was no body to bury, just fragments and ash, sealed away in a polished mahogany box. I remember the day of the funeral with painful clarity. I remember slipping his favourite possession into the casket before they lowered the lid. It was a clunky, grey Motorola cellular phone, the kind that looked like a brick. It was a sentimental, foolish gesture of a grieving mother who wanted her boy to have a line to the world, even in the dark. I watched the earth cover him. I watched the grass grow over that plot for 3 decades. Last Sunday evening, the atmosphere in my dining room was colder than the winter wind rattling the window panes. I sat across from Vivian, the woman Marcus had married shortly before his death. She had played the role of the grieving widow for 30 years, living off the trust fund I managed, yet never remarrying. We were cutting into our roast beef in tense silence when a sound shattered the room. It was a digital trill, monotone, distinct, archaic. My fork clattered onto my porcelain plate. The sound was not coming from a modern smartphone. It was the distinctive electronic chirping of a device from the mid-90s, and it was coming from inside the locked antique china cabinet against the wall. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. That was impossible. That phone was 6 feet underground, rotting in a suit pocket. I looked up at Vivian, expecting to see shock or terror on her face. I expected her to scream. Instead, she picked up her wine glass. She did not look at the cabinet. She looked directly at me. The corner of her mouth curled upward in a faint, icy smirk. She was not surprised. She was waiting. I pushed my chair back and walked toward the cabinet on trembling legs. The ringing persisted, demanding and loud. I turned the small brass key and pulled the glass door open. There, nestled between the gravy boat and the tea set, sat the grey Motorola. It looked pristine, without a speck of grave dirt on it. I reached out and grabbed the cold plastic. I pressed the talk button and brought it to my ear, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "Mom?" The voice was a whisper, but it was unmistakable. It was not the voice of a ghost. It was the voice of a young man, terrified and urgent. "Mom, don't sign. They are coming for you." The line clicked and went dead. I lowered the phone slowly, the silence rushing back into the room like a flood. I turned to face my daughter-in-law. Vivian was watching me with the eyes of a predator who had finally sprung a trap. She took a calm sip of her wine, the smirk lingering on her lips. In that instant, The grief that had blinded me for 30 years dissolved. The tears I had shed over that grave dried up, replaced by a cold, sharp rage. The phone in my hand was solid proof that my reality was a lie. Marcus was not in the ground, and Vivian had known the truth every single day of those 30 years. I stood there clutching the cold plastic of the Motorola, my mind racing back to a rainy Tuesday 3 decades ago. The memory of Marcus's funeral had always been a blur of black umbrellas and wet earth. But now the fog was lifting, revealing the sharp edges of a staged performance. I remembered the casket. It was a heavy mahogany box, sealed shut with an air of finality that felt rushed. The authorities had suggested a closed casket due to the severity of the plane crash, but it was Vivian who had enforced it. She was barely in her 20s then, just Marcus's girlfriend at the time. Yet she had moved with the authority of a grieving widow long before the title was legally hers. She had held my hand with a grip that felt more like restraint than comfort, and whispered that I should remember him as he was. She insisted that opening the lid would only haunt me. I had believed her compassion then, but now I saw it as calculation. The paperwork had been equally chaotic. I recalled the death certificate sitting on my mahogany desk, a document rife with sealed addendums and signatures from officials I had never heard of in Eastbridge. At the time, I was drowning in sorrow, too weak to question why a local coroner had been bypassed for a private medical examiner. Vivienne had handled the logistics. She was the only one who had travelled to the crash site to identify the remains. She had returned with a tear-streaked face and a terrifyingly detailed story of a body burned beyond recognition, save for a few personal effects. I had never questioned why she, a young woman who fainted at the sight of blood, had volunteered for such a gruesome task while I stayed behind. My memory shifted to the weeks leading up to the accident. Marcus and Vivian were not the picture of young love. The air between them had been thick with tension. I remembered walking past the library late one night and hearing Marcus's voice raised in fear, not anger. He had been arguing with someone on the phone, talking about something being too dangerous and how he wanted out. When I asked him about it the next morning, he had dismissed it as work stress. But Ravenhill Capital Reserve, the firm where I spent my career, had flagged irregularities in accounts linked to Marcus shortly after his disappearance. I had buried those warnings deep in my mind, dismissing them as clerical errors or identity theft targeting the deceased. Now, the pieces were slamming together with violent force. The warning on the phone was not a random plea. It was specific. Do not sign. For the past month, Vivienne and her team of aggressive lawyers had been pressuring me to sign over the final control of the Whitford family trust. They claimed it was for tax purposes, a way to secure the estate for future generations. But there were no future generations. There was only Vivienne. She had not just survived my son. She had consumed his life. I looked at her across the dining room, and the realization made my blood run cold. She had known he was alive. She had likely known for 30 years. Every tear she shed at his memorial, every bouquet she placed on his empty grave, had been a lie. I was not surrounded by family. I was trapped in a house with a woman who had spent half her life waiting for me to sign away what was left of my son's legacy. I retreated to my study and locked the heavy oak door behind me. My hands were no longer trembling. The shock of hearing Marcus's voice had crystallized into a cold, professional focus. I was back in my element now. I was not just a grieving mother anymore. I was a treasury manager who had spent a lifetime hunting down discrepancies. and I was about to audit the last 30 years of my life. I sat before my computer and pulled up the encrypted archives of the family trust. Vivienne believed she had insulated herself with lawyers and complex jargon. But she forgot that I wrote the original bylaws of the estate. I bypassed the user-friendly interface the bank provided and went straight into the raw transaction data. I needed to see the flow of cash from the moment the funeral service ended. The screen populated with rows of numbers, and the pattern emerged almost immediately. It was subtle, the kind of bleed that looks like administrative noise unless you know exactly where to look. Starting 2 months after the crash, there were recurring withdrawals from the Marcus Whitford Memorial Trust. They were labelled innocuously as custodial fees or legal retainers. In 1995, the amount was $3,000 a month. By 2005, it had escalated to $8,000. Currently, the monthly drain was $15,000. I did the mental math instantly. Over 3 decades, nearly $4 million had been siphoned out of an account that was supposed to be frozen for a dead man. Vivienne had not been living off the interest of her widow's pension, as she claimed. She had been paying for something, or someone. I drilled down into the routing numbers. The money was not going into Vivienne's personal accounts. It was being funneled through a shell company registered in Delaware called Archway Solutions. It was a classic laundering tactic, but I had the software to pierce the veil. I traced the wire transfers from Archway to their final destination. The money always landed in the same place, a private account linked to an entity named the Harrowside Institute. The name sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the drafty house. I opened a new browser window and typed in the name. The results were sparse and sanitized. Harrowside described itself as a long-term residential facility for specialized psychiatric care, located in a remote part of the state. But when I dug deeper, accessing cached forums and archived local news reports, a darker picture formed. There were articles about lawsuits that had been quietly settled out of court. There were threads on conspiracy forums discussing the Institute as a place where wealthy families sent their problems to disappear. I found a blog post from 12 years ago, written by an investigative journalist who had later died in a car wreck. He claimed that Harrowside specialized in creating new realities for patients who needed to be removed from society without the messiness of a public scandal. He called it a warehouse for the inconveniently alive. I looked back at the transaction logs. The payments coincided perfectly with the timeline of Marcus's death. The crash had been the cover. The funeral had been the distraction. And the money was the upkeep. My son had not burned in a plane crash over the ocean. He had been bought and paid for, shipped off to a facility that specialized in erasing people. And Vivienne had been signing the checks every month for 30 years. The phone call was not a haunting. It was a prison break. The silence in the house had changed. It was no longer empty. It was heavy, filled with the pressure of things unseen. I had spent the last few hours in my study, printing out every incriminating ledger and hiding the files under the loose floorboard beneath my vanity. I was exhausted, my mind fraying at the edges, but sleep was a luxury I could not afford. It was 3 a.m. when I heard the distinct creak of my bedroom door hinge. I had been dozing in the armchair in the corner of the room, shrouded in shadow. Through the gloom, I watched the silhouette of my daughter-in-law slip inside. Vivienne did not move like a grieving widow. She moved like a thief. She went straight to my bedside table, her fingers scrabbling frantically at the drawers. She was looking for the documents. She was looking for the proof I had unearthed about the Harrowside Institute. I clicked the lamp on. The sudden light flooded the room, catching Vivienne in a pose of guilt. Her hand was deep inside my drawer. She did not jump. She simply froze, her back to me, before slowly turning around. Her face was a mask of concern that did not reach her eyes. She told me she had heard me moaning in my sleep. She said she was looking for my heart medication because she was worried about my stress levels. It was a smooth lie, delivered with the terrifying practice of a sociopath. I told her to get out. She left. But as she closed the door, the look she gave me was not one of submission. It was a look of assessment. She was trying to calculate how much I knew. I waited until sunrise to leave my room. The house felt like a trap now. Every shadow looked like a threat. I went downstairs to the kitchen to make coffee, needing the caffeine to sharpen my dull senses. I walked past the dining room table and stopped dead in my tracks. My breath hitched in my chest. Sitting in the center of the polished mahogany table, right where the Motorola had been the night before, was a photograph. It was a 5x7 glossy print of Marcus, taken the summer before he disappeared. He was standing on a pier, laughing, the wind catching his hair. I gripped the doorframe to keep from falling. I knew this photo. I knew exactly where it was supposed to be. I had placed it inside the wall, safe in the library 3 years ago. I had spun the dial myself. I had checked the lock. I had not opened that safe since. My mind began to reel. Had I taken it out and forgotten? Was the stress finally breaking my mind? Was this the onset of the dementia that Vivian had subtly hinted at during our dinners? I walked over and picked up the photo. It was cold. There was no dust on it. It had been placed there recently. This was not my memory failing. This was a message. She could get to my secrets. She could get to my safe. Nowhere in this house was secure. Just as the panic began to constrict my throat, the landline on the kitchen wall began to ring. It was a shrill, mechanical sound that seemed to pierce right through my skull. I stared at it. Who would call the house phone at 6 a.m? I picked up the receiver slowly. Hello? Eleanor? It was a man's voice, but it was not Marcus. This voice was rough, wet, and broken. The man sounded like he was drowning in his own lungs. He was coughing violently, a hacking sound that made me flinch. Who is this? I demanded, gripping the phone tight. The man took a ragged breath. Do not trust her, he rasped. She is listening. She is always listening. The line went dead before I could ask another question. I stood there in the pale morning light, clutching the phone, looking at the smiling face of my son in the photograph on the table. The game had changed. This was no longer just about financial fraud or a faked death. I was being hunted in my own home, and the walls were closing in. I waited until Vivian left the house for her morning yoga session before I made my move. The moment her silver sedan disappeared around the bend of the long driveway, I stepped out onto the front porch. The air was thick with fog, but I saw him immediately. A man in a faded grey maintenance uniform was standing by the stone gate at the end of the property. He did not come closer. He simply locked eyes with me, pointed to the hollow beneath the large oak tree near the mailbox, and then turned to vanish into the dense woods. I ran down the driveway, my loafers skidding on the damp gravel. Beneath the tree, half buried under a pile of wet leaves, was a dirty manila envelope. I grabbed it and retreated to my car, locking the doors before I dared to open it. My hands shook as I dumped the contents onto the passenger seat. The first item was a plastic identification card. It was cracked down the middle and stained with something dark that looked uncomfortably like dried blood. The name field was blank, but the designation was printed in bold, black letters. It read, Patient 27. I ran my thumb over the jagged edge of the plastic. This was not a hospital badge. It looked like something meant for a high-security prisoner. Beneath the card was a crumpled photocopy of a biometric intake form. The header bore the logo of the Harrowside Institute. I scanned the document, and my heart hammered against my ribs. The date on the form was 3 days after the plane crash. The section for identification contained a full set of 10 fingerprints. I stopped breathing. The official report from the authorities had been absolute. They claimed the fire was so intense that not even bone fragments remained intact. They said there was nothing to fingerprint. Yet here, on this page, were 10 perfect impressions. I looked closer at the print for the left index finger. There was a tiny, lateral gap in the ridges. It was the scar Marcus got when he was 7 years old, slicing his finger on a jagged tin can. It was a mark only a mother would memorize. These were his prints. He had not burned. He had been processed. The final piece of paper was a log of visitor entries. It was a list of dates and times, stretching back over 2 decades. The name of the visitor was listed as Veronica Miller. I did not know anyone by that name. But as I looked at the signature column, a wave of nausea rolled over me. The handwriting was distinct. The capital letters were overly large, looping with a pretension I saw every day on my kitchen counter. I pulled my checkbook out of my purse and held it next to the log. The signature on the visitor log was identical to the endorsement on the checks I wrote to Vivian for household expenses. The dates aligned perfectly with her monthly spa weekends. She had not been going to a resort. She had been driving 3 hours north to visit a facility where my son was reduced to a number. She had visited him over 200 times while I mourned an empty casket. I started the engine of my car. I was done crying. It was time to go to war. I drove to a nondescript motel on the edge of the highway and paid cash for a room. I did not want to sleep. I needed a secure line. I set up my laptop on the cheap laminate desk and pulled up the back-end portal for Archway Solutions. My years in finance had taught me that every shell company had a digital paper trail, and whoever set this up was arrogant. They had used the same administrative password for the billing department as they did for the client access portal. I typed in the sequence of numbers I had deciphered from the bank statements. The screen flickered, and then the Harrowside Institute intranet materialized in front of me. I was not looking for financial data anymore. I was looking for a human being. I navigated to the patient directory. It was a cold, sterile list of numbers, devoid of names. I typed in the number from the blood-stained identification card. 27. The search bar spun for a moment before pulling up a file titled Long-Term Patient Maintenance. The title made my stomach turn. It sounded like they were storing old furniture, not caring for the sick. I opened the file and began to read. The medical jargon was dense, but the disciplinary notes were terrifyingly clear. The entry for patient 27 was flagged in bright red. It stated that the subject was a high flight risk. It detailed an incident from 3 days ago. The log said the subject had briefly breached the perimeter and accessed a restricted communication room before being subdued. My heart leapt into my throat. That was the night of the phone call. Marcus had not just found a phone by luck. He had fought his way to it. He had escaped, even if only for a few minutes. Just to warn me. I scrolled further down the digital page, looking for the authorization protocols. I needed to know who was giving the orders to keep him sedated and locked away. I found the section labeled Custodial Authority. There was a strict instruction to limit all external contact and to report any behavioral changes immediately to the primary contact. The note at the bottom was brief and chilling. Next, of kin Vivienne L. I stared at the screen until my eyes burned. The L likely stood for Lawrence, her maiden name, a flimsy attempt at anonymity that she had likely used to set this up decades ago. She was not just a beneficiary of his death. She was his warden. She had authorized the restraints. She had approved the sedatives. She had kept my son in a cage for 30 years while she drank wine at my table. I closed the laptop with a snap. I was done investigating. I knew who the enemy was, and I knew where she was keeping him. I stood up and smoothed my skirt. I was 58 years old, a widow, and a grandmother figure to the neighborhood. But as I walked out of that hotel room, I felt dangerous. I returned to the house just as the sun was setting, casting long, bruised shadows across the living room floor. Vivienne was sitting on the velvet sofa, swirling a glass of Pinot Noir, looking for all the world like the queen of a kingdom she had stolen. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply walked over to the coffee table and placed the photocopy of the visitor log directly on top of her fashion magazine. She looked at the paper. Then she looked at me. There was no gasp of surprise this time. The mask of the grieving widow simply evaporated, revealing the cold, bored woman beneath. She took a slow sip of her wine and asked me if I was finally done digging. I asked her why. That was the only word I could manage. She stood up and walked to the window, turning her back to me. She told me that my son was not the saint I remembered. She said Marcus had been brilliant with numbers, but he lacked the stomach for the real world. 30 years ago, he had stumbled upon a massive money laundering operation within the firm's subsidiary accounts. It was not just a few $1,000s. It was millions. Instead of looking the other way, instead of taking the cut he was offered, Marcus had decided to be a hero. He was preparing to go to the federal authorities. Vivienne turned around, her face devoid of guilt. She told me that his morality would have destroyed everything. It would have bankrupted the family and sent people she cared about to prison. So, a solution was arranged. The plane crash was never an accident. It was a piece of theater designed to erase a liability. I felt the blood drain from my face. I asked her if she had killed him for money. She laughed, a dry, humorless sound. She told me it was not that simple. The plan was for him to die in the impact. It was supposed to be quick. But Marcus was stubborn. She told me that when the recovery team, her team, arrived at the crash site in the marshlands, they did not find a corpse. They found a broken, bleeding man crawling through the mud, whispering my name. I gripped the back of the armchair to keep from collapsing. My son had been alive. He had been in pain, calling for his mother, and she had been there. Vivienne stepped closer, her voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. She said she had a choice to make in that moment. She could call an ambulance, save his life, and let him go to the police to ruin them all. Or she could finish what the crash had started. But she did not kill him. She claimed she was merciful. She decided that if he could not be dead, he had to be gone. She made a call to a contact at the Harrowside Institute. They specialized in problem management for the elite. She told me that Marcus Whitford died on paper that day, but the man who survived the wreckage was sedated, bound, and shipped to the facility to be processed. She looked me in the eye and told me that for 30 years she had paid for his room and board. She said I should be grateful. She had kept him alive. She had kept him safe from the consequences of his own conscience. And in exchange, she took the life he was supposed to have. I looked at the woman I had shared meals with for 3 decades. I saw a monster. But she had made a fatal error. She thought telling me the truth would break me. She thought the horror of it would make me retreat. She was wrong. Knowing he was alive did not break me. It gave me a target. I pulled my beige sedan up to the security checkpoint of the Harrowside Institute at 9 in the morning. I was dressed in my most severe charcoal suit, the one I used to wear when I had to fire junior executives at Ravenhill. I did not look like a desperate mother searching for her lost son. I looked like a liability auditor. And in my experience, that was far more terrifying to a corrupt organization than any weapon. I flashed a forged laminate badge that I had printed at a 24-hour copy shop and told the guard I was sent by Archway Solutions to verify the asset allocation before the next fiscal quarter. The threat of a financial freeze opened the heavy steel gates faster than a battering ram. I walked into the main lobby, my heels clicking a sharp, authoritative rhythm on the linoleum floor. The air inside smelled of bleach and despair. I bullied my way past the receptionist, demanding to be taken to the high-security wing immediately. I told the flustered administrator that if I did not physically verify the existence of the long-term residents, the monthly wire transfers would be suspended by noon. We took a freight elevator down to the basement level. The atmosphere shifted here. It was colder, and the hum of ventilation fans drowned out the silence. We walked down a long, concrete corridor lined with heavy steel doors. At the very end of the hall, a single door stood apart from the rest. It was marked with a simple brass plaque that read, Room 27. Unlike the other rooms, this one was guarded. A man with a thick neck and a sidearm holstered at his hip stood in front of it, his arms crossed. The administrator tried to stop me, saying it was a restricted quarantine zone, but I pushed past him. I walked right up to the guard and held up my clipboard. I told him that his paycheck came from the account I was auditing, and if he did not step aside, he would be looking for a new job by the end of the day. The guard hesitated. He looked at the administrator, who gave a nervous nod. Slowly, the guard stepped back and punched a code into the keypad. The lock disengaged with a heavy metallic thud. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it would bruise my ribs. I took a breath and pushed the door open. The room was dimly lit, smelling of stale sweat and strong sedatives. In the center of the room, a figure lay curled up on a cot facing the wall. I stepped inside, my voice trembling as I called out to him. I said his name. The figure on the bed stirred. He groaned, a sound of deep, medicated misery. I rushed to the bedside and reached out to touch his shoulder. I grabbed him and pulled him over, desperate to see his face, desperate to see the eyes of the boy I had mourned for 30 years. The man rolled onto his back, and the air left my lungs in a rush of horror. It was not Marcus. The man staring up at me with glazed, vacant eyes was a stranger. He was roughly the same age as Marcus would be, and he had the same dark hair. But the structure of his face was wrong. His nose was crooked. His eyes were blue, not brown. This was a decoy. I stared at the stranger, and the cruelty of the scheme crashed down on me. Vivian had not just hidden Marcus. She had created a phantom. She was paying Harrowside to keep this random, drugged man in a cell under Marcus's patient number so that if anyone ever checked, there would be a body in the bed. My son was not here. I was standing in a cage meant for a ghost, and the real Marcus was still out there. hidden in the dark. I turned my back on the drugged stranger and faced the sweating administrator. I told him that I had a federal agent on speed dial and that if he did not tell me where my son was, I would burn this entire facility to the ground with lawsuits and criminal charges. The man crumbled. He was a bureaucrat, not a soldier, and he saw his life ending in a prison cell. He gestured frantically for me to follow him out of the containment wing and into his private office. He locked the door and went straight to a grey filing cabinet in the corner, his hands shaking so badly he dropped his keys twice. He pulled out a thick, dusty folder that smelled of mildew and neglect. He placed it on the desk and opened it. The first document was a transfer order dated 28 years ago. The administrator spoke in a hurried, hushed tone. He told me that Marcus had indeed been admitted here after the crash, but he was only kept at Harrowside for 2 years. The facility was not secure enough for what Vivian needed. She had moved him. I asked him why she kept him alive at all, if she had already staged his death. The administrator pointed to a note in the margin of the file. It referenced a cognitive encryption key. He explained that Marcus had built the digital infrastructure for the accounts Vivian was draining. He had embedded a security protocol that required a specific, rotating alphanumeric sequence that only he could generate. If he died, the money would remain locked in the digital ether forever. Vivian did not keep him alive out of mercy. She kept him alive because he was a human ATM machine. She needed him to speak the codes. The administrator reached into the back of the drawer and pulled out a small, black micro-cassette recorder. He told me that during the first year, they recorded the sessions to analyze Marcus's resistance levels. He placed the device on the desk and pressed the play button. The magnetic tape hissed, a sound that seemed to scratch against my soul. Then, a voice cut through the static. It was young, broken, and terrified. "Please," the voice sobbed. "Please stop. I will give you the number. Just let me talk to her." I covered my mouth with my hand to stifle a scream. It was Marcus. "Mom." His voice cracked on the recording. "Mom, if you can hear me, I am sorry." I tried to stop them. "Mom, come get me." The recording ended with a sharp click. The silence that followed was deafening. I stared at the small black device. For 28 years, while I slept in a warm bed and visited an empty grave, my son had been begging for me. He had been tortured for codes and sequences. Vivian had turned his brilliant mind into a tool for her greed. I looked up at the administrator. I did not feel fear anymore. I felt a cold, absolute clarity. I took the file and the recorder. I knew what I had to do. I was going to find where she had moved him, and then I was going to make her pay for every single second of the last 30 years. The 30th memorial service for Marcus was designed to be Vivian's coronation. She had arranged for a lavish ceremony in the estate gardens, inviting every prominent figure in Eastbridge. A podium was set up next to the large portrait of my son, and a notary was waiting with the documents that would transfer the entirety of the family assets into her sole control. She stood before the crowd, dabbing dry eyes with a lace handkerchief, looking every inch the tragic, enduring widow. She reached for the pen, ready to sign away the last of my son's legacy. That was when I signaled the sound technician I had hired. The somber classical music cut out abruptly. A harsh static filled the garden, followed by the unmistakable voice of the Harrowside administrator confessing to the systemic laundering of the Whitford fortune. The crowd gasped, murmuring in confusion. Vivian froze. the pen hovering over the paper. I stepped up to the podium, not as a frail old woman, but as an executioner. I gestured to the large projection screen behind her. The image of Marcus appeared. It was grainy footage from 3 years ago, taken inside a secure room. He looked older, gaunt, and exhausted. But he was alive. He was reciting a sequence of numbers, his eyes dead with resignation. The timestamp on the video proved he had been alive decades after his funeral. Vivian dropped the pen. She looked at the sea of accusing faces and realized her performance was over. Panic seized her. She shoved the notary aside and bolted toward the wrought-iron gates, sprinting in her heels across the manicured lawn. She ran instinctively toward the family cemetery plot, perhaps thinking she could hide in the only place she had ever felt safe, the site of her greatest lie. But the police were already waiting there. I watched from the terrace as they handcuffed her right in front of the empty grave she had visited for 30 years. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic for her accomplices. The raid on the Harrowside Institute dominated the national news for weeks. Federal agents swarmed the facility, seizing servers and liberating patients who had been erased from society. But my work was not done. The files I seized revealed that Marcus had been moved to a private, unlisted nursing home in a neighboring state, registered under a pseudonym. I found him 2 days later. He was sitting in a wheelchair by a window, staring out at a parking lot. He was physically frail, his legs atrophied from years of confinement, and his spirit was scarred by decades of isolation. When I walked into the room, he did not react at first. Then, I said his name. He turned slowly, and the recognition in his eyes broke me. We did not speak for a long time. We just held each other, weeping for the stolen years. In the quiet days that followed, Marcus revealed the final, twisting knife of the truth. It had not started with Vivian. She was merely a pawn. The architect of the entire scheme had been her mother, a woman I had once considered a close friend. Her mother had orchestrated the crash and the blackmail, training her daughter to be the jailer. Vivian had inherited the sin, but she had embraced it with a terrifying willingness. I never returned to the house in Eastbridge. I sold the estate, the furniture, and the memories. I used the money to buy a quiet home near the coast where Marcus could heal in peace. On my last day in town, I drove to the edge of the lake where Marcus used to fish as a boy. I took the grey Motorola phone out of my purse. It was heavy, a relic of a time when I was blind to the monsters in my kitchen. I looked at it one last time, then threw it as hard as I could. It splashed into the dark water and sank, silencing the past forever. I got back into my car and drove away, ready to help my son learn how to live again. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and share your thoughts on this family tragedy. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to subscribe to Grandma's Family Diary, like this video, and smash that hype button so we can share this warning with even more people.